Hey everyone, welcome to our panel discussion on S&OP, the path to a unified supply chain plan. Welcome to the panel discussion I'm having today with, I got three great panelists for you who are some of the top experts in S&OP in Canada and perhaps even the world. We have Jonathon, Karelse, Leidy, Lopez, and David Rawlingson. Today we're going to talk about sales and operations planning and really the journey towards an S&OP process and any of the roadblocks you can find on the way, whether they're cultural or driven by any other obstacle. So to get started, I want to start to introduce the panel we have for you today. I'm going to start with myself. So my name is Bloem. I'm an implementation consultant with Slimstock. I lead the onboarding of some of our customers on our Slim4 platform, which is a platform for both traditional operations planning, meaning demand and supply planning, but also sales and operations planning, which we'll be talking about today. I've been with Slimstock for about 10 years. I've been leading many of these projects, and yeah, that's basically me. Today also on the call we have Jonathon Karelse from NorthFind Management. Jonathon, welcome. You want to take a minute to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Danny. Always a pleasure to be here. There's a lot of words on the slide that they gave you about you, so I will keep it a little bit more brief. I'm a lifelong practitioner of S&OP. So I'm on the consulting side now, but prior to consulting, I worked at a number of large multinationals and was part of the global S&OP rollouts. And since then, me and my team are really honored to have been able to work with maybe not hundreds, but close to hundreds of different companies in different verticals and different geographies at various stages in their S&OP journey, from implementation to tweaking mature processes to try to achieve best in class. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. I think there's a lot of conversations that have changed during COVID, but in particular, there's a lot of focus now on supply chain, and with the focus on supply chain, a lot of folks are talking about S&OP. So it's a great timely discussion, and hopefully we're going to be able to leave the guests and attendees with some tangible insights they can take back to their organizations.
Thank you, Jonathon, for this extensive introduction. Next on this panel we have there was no bad comment there. That was just just being nice. Next on the panel is Leidy Lopez from Factors Group. Leidy, would you take a minute to introduce yourself, but also Factors Group to the audience?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Leidy Lopez, and I'm the Senior Manager for Demand Planning at Factors Group. I have more than 15 years of experience in supply chain, mainly in planning and procurement. I have worked in manufacturing and also in high-tech industries, and now I'm in the nutraceutical company, working for one of the biggest companies in Canada that produce supplements, and I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you, Leidy. Last on the panel we have David Rawlingson, Director of Supply Chain at Tree of Life. David, can you tell us a bit about yourself and your current role?
Yes, thank you. David Rawlingson, Director of Supply Chain at Tree of Life. I've been in supply chain over 20 years. I had the luxury of working in many different areas of supply chain, whether it's logistics, inventory, forecasting, as well as warehouse operations. I've been involved in manufacturing companies, as well as distribution companies, which is what Tree of Life is currently, a food distribution company, and we service the large retailers. And it's fantastic to work in an industry where food is so important to the general public and it's been a very busy time over the last year for us with the demands on supply chain. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to contributing.
Thank you, David. So now, before we actually go into the panel discussion, I want to take a couple of minutes to introduce Slimstock to the wider audience. For those who do not know us, Slimstock is a global provider of inventory management solutions. So, you know, as we're going into this S&OP discussion, traditionally we've been working with, you know, the layer below sales and operations planning, so demand planning and supply planning. And we'll talk about the differences later. Our platform is active at, you know, we have about 1,200 customers on our platform. We're, I said, a global provider with local supports. We have offices in the US and Canada, up here in Toronto. We have an office in Chicago and near Denver. We do about 150 implementations in every year. We're actually exceeding that this year already. And we have about 26 offices across the globe, so quite extensive. And basically, we're a software provider that consists of basically our solution suite focuses on anything that touches inventory. So that means forecasting, both from an operational perspective, but also from a sales and operations level. Inventory management, assortments, promotions management. As I said, we do sales and operations planning and IBP, product lifecycle management, and order optimization, and a couple of other things. So anything that touches inventory is what our software has solutions for. So that being said, I want to take a minute to introduce the topic of S&OP. You know, from a Slimstock perspective, what is sales and operations planning, and how do we see it fit into our world? There might be different definitions out there, but basically, if we look at, you know, Gartner, they identify 5 S&OP maturity stages, with typical S&OP being step number 3. So a company would typically move from silo planning, so that's a traditional approach, then go into operational excellence, so having optimized inventory, production planning, supply chain planning, having an integrated function to drive demand from a forecast and taking care of the replenishment. The third step would be sales and operation planning, so really taking that step above, looking at more long-term impacts in the supply chain, aligning budgets versus actuals, and really having a long-term view where we unify not only, you know, the inventory, but also operations and logistics, finance, and the sales budget, obviously. Then we have the 4th level, which is IBP, which is the actual more strategic planning, integrated business planning, taking top-down initiatives from the C-level down into, you know, actionable budgets and planning that an operational team can execute on. And last but not least, obviously, we have step 5, which is the external business planning. So the collaboration with both customers and suppliers at a strategical level. So our platform now currently supports basically any of these steps. We see S&OP very much as the first step in taking a bottom-up forecast, taking an operational forecast, having all your execution parameters, having a forecast, having product life cycle information in their promotions, and aggregate that and align it with a base or a budget, aligning it with your autonomous growth and reviewing how you're doing compared to the targets that a company has set out. So if we go on from step 3, we would be going into our IBP process. This is where we have our bottom-up information, but we also consolidate and capture the actual business growth that's probably not part of my operational forecast yet. Might not even be part of my S&OP, but you know, we're talking directives from the C-level suite, growth due to entry into new regions, introduction of new business lines, tender management, opening up new locations, anything that, from an operational perspective, you can't really start planning yet is what really comes back into IBP. So there's rough goals that are impossible to translate into an operational forecast, and that's where we see IBP living. So that being said, this being our Slimstock perspective on it, I want to go into the panel discussion. I'm going to put a couple of slides back to a more generic slide, and I think a couple of questions we're going to discuss with the panel today. So first thing, I want to actually pose a question to Jonathon. So if we're looking at the we're looking at the difference of S&OP versus demand and supply planning. What, from your perspective, is the actual difference between the two? Because I think I notice in a lot of companies the terms are confused, and I know you have an opinion about S&OP being a more tactical or more strategical approach to planning. What in your eyes is the difference between the two?
Well, maybe let's take a step back from that, and I promise I will answer it. And even look at this slide, which I also have an opinion about. I think Gartner does many things well, and researching things and ranking things and making magic quadrants is definitely their bread and butter. So there's definitely a benefit to looking at stages of maturity. But the reason I think it's worth saying something about this slide before digging into that difference between demand planning, supply planning, and S&OP, is that we've got about, it looks like 50 people on the call, give or take. And there's probably some of the people on the call who aren't yet S&OP practitioners. They're probably looking at this saying, I've heard a lot of people talking about S&OP. I hear rumblings of S&OP in my organization, and I want to understand more. What is S&OP and what's the best practice? And I think one of the things that's gotten kind of confusing over the last few years, is definitely not just in the last year during COVID, although things have gotten confusing for demand planning during that period as well, is this idea that when we're talking about S&OP, we're talking about something distinct from IBP, we're talking something distinct from Ibp. I think S&OP done well is an attempt to, you had a great slide, I think, following this one, don't flip it, is an attempt to reconcile those bottom-up inputs with the top-down strategies of the organization. It's that critical linkage between what do we want to accomplish as an organization strategically over a strategic horizon? Where do we want to be 1, 2, 3, 5 years from now? And then being able to translate these dreams and aspirations into something that is tactically executable. And even as we're making these dreams, to be cognizant of what the realities of our business are. So connecting those basic blocking and tackling functions of execution in the work centers, in the scheduling, finance scheduling, through to planning at a longer horizon, and then up to strategy. And for that reason, I don't think necessarily that S&OP, IBP, and Ibp need to be considered distinct practices. I think what they're better understood by those of you who aren't yet practitioners is there may be different stages of maturity, where S&OP is the beginning of that framework that connects top to bottom, and IBP further consolidates those linkages, especially with finance. Danny made reference quite rightly to the importance of being able to link strategic plans to budgets that are then executable, and that budget key is key. That budget piece is key. And then Ibp, which honestly, I just got back from a conference and we were talking about internal and external collaboration, and people there were talking about CPFR, which for those of you who haven't heard of it is Collaborative Planning, Forecasting, and Replenishment. Honestly, Ibp is a new one for me. And I would argue that with effective S&OP or IBP, you can still be linking up and down your supply chain to suppliers and customers. In fact, that you should be. But if you want to recognize your capability of doing that with a new acronym, by all means, that's fine. Getting back then in my long-winded way, Danny, I'm sorry, to your original question, which is what's the distinction between demand planning and supply planning and S&OP, is I would say demand planning and supply planning are what sits at the heart of S&OP. They are those intrinsic demand and supply planning capabilities, but they in and of themselves are not S&OP because they don't connect further across the organization to unify product planning, the strategic plans of finance, as well as the longer term strategic objectives of the executive. So they sit right at the core of S&OP for sure, but S&OP per se requires that I'm also bringing in those other parts of the organization.
Mm-hmm. So that definitely does answer the question quite extensively. So maybe Leidy, from your perspective, being a demand planning manager, right? Because you could envision demand planning living at both, a very operational level, used to actually drive I guess in your case that's going to be a production plan, but also an S&OP forecast that lives at a higher level. How do you see those differences come back in the approach you create forecasts or have your team work on these forecasts?
Do you mean in terms of demand planning as a part of the S&OP process?
Yeah, like what are the differences between an operational forecast versus the S&OP forecast?
I think with the proper S&OP, you can get more information and more awareness of how the other areas are operating, and therefore that contributes to get a better forecast. I think mainly that information flow from sales and marketing, and also supply planning and finance, that would give you a better overview of the numbers and the figures going forward. And also having a longer horizon, which is part of the S&OP, a more strategic planning and longer horizon, that would definitely give the company better ways to plan their resources going forward.
So the longer term, you say, would be more used for resources, you say. So we're looking at factory capacity, or planning the people that need to work in the factory.
And also for finance too. It will give them the information about how the company plans to perform in 12 to 15 months ahead, and they can better plan financially with the banks and the lenders.
But as a big, I know, Jonathon, you've been working in CFO roles. I guess what's the importance for that sort of planning? Because I typically think about it as a demand planner. That's where I come from.
Sure.
What's important in finance?
I think there's two really important points to ensure everyone sees when we're talking about S&OP. The first is, and you mentioned it earlier, was in budgeting. Now, in a lot of organizations, I don't know what it's like for you, David. I do know what it's like for you, Leidy, because we did work together for a few years. But in a lot of organizations, budgeting is a painful process. It's a once annual process that takes so long that by the time the budgeting is done, all the original assumptions of that budget are already out the window. And one of the beauties of S&OP or Ibp or Ibp is that because it's an iterative process that, like Leidy said, is consistently looking ahead 12, 15, 18, even 24 months, if I'm doing S&OP well, at any given time, I've already got a financial snapshot of my next year's fiscal performance. And not just from a demand standpoint, but a full, not to a detail level of P&L, but I've got my costs, I've got my operational costs, I've even got probably a projection of what my EBITDA and net income is going to look like. What's really important for finance, and this is a mistake that a lot of organizations make, even organizations doing S&OP, is as they start to refine their demand planning processes, as they start to put more emphasis on the process, start to train their people, get better tools, and they get excited about the new insights that they're starting to see, they convince finance to begin linking budgets and cash flow plans to the S&OP process. That's a good thing. The bad thing is they link it to demand. And the reason I say that's a bad thing is because demand done well in an S&OP process is unconstrained. But in real life, there are always constraints. So cash flow planning from a CFO standpoint coming out of S&OP needs to be contingent on the constrained supply plan. That is, the net result of these unconstrained demand forecasts that I've produced, subject to the reality of constraints in raw material, in physical capacity, in labor, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really key that finance is linking to that constrained output of the S&OP process, not the top of the funnel.
Interesting. David, so I know you at Tree of Life, I think you're early in the transition to sales and operations planning. I think it's a process you're just starting, you know, right in the beginning when all the change management is going on. What are, you know, some of the first steps you're taking to make people aware of what S&OP is, and you know, what is your actual plan to have senior leadership involved, or other senior leaders?
Well, that's a great question, and I mean a lot of it. And I'll talk about cultural change, and I think we talked about this the other day. Is, you know, we get caught up in, and Jonathon used this point last week when we talked about, you know, this is not a tool you just sort of pull out of your belt and say, here's what we're going to do. This is a whole change to the organization that you have to look at, bringing all these areas together to come up with a great forecast, a great budget. And you know, you said budgeting is a real struggle. It's definitely a struggle at our place for sure. And there was a time when we didn't even have the marketing and sales plans interacting. So you were really missing a few key pieces. So bringing the whole supply plan, the whole demand plan, all the constraints, and using the monthly meetings to review exactly what you're doing compared to your budget, so you can really see what you're bringing in, what you're putting out. And as Jonathon mentioned, as a financial part, you know, you have to link at some point in time what you're spending, but at least you have a plan around how you're going to do that, and not just you know, start buying stuff and throwing things throwing mud at the wall because you don't know what your plan is. And then also putting a little bit of adding a little bit of quality to some of those forecasts you have, and holding some accountability within the organization, not just guessing at what you think you're going to buy. And I think that's really important from that perspective. So.
Yeah, Danny, David hit the nail on the head from my perspective on what S&OP is. And I recognize we're, what time is it? It's 25 minutes in, and I don't know if we've actually talked specifically about what it is, but I think it's really important, especially again for those of you on the call who are not yet practitioners, to understand if your organization or your department is viewing S&OP as a tactical tool to go solve a specific problem, like you've got an inventory problem. Well, probably a better place to start would be to talk to Slimstock. Don't do S&OP. You've got a forecasting problem. Okay, if you've got a forecasting problem, don't do S&OP, because you have to get that part right first. S&OP, like David said, is a cultural framework. It's really about a company-wide collaborative framework that links all these key functional areas to be able to orchestrate the strategic plans of the organization down to the tactical execution. But if you don't have the execution pieces in place yet, you're not going to be able to do S&OP. And I'll give probably a rather unpopular opinion and say, anybody who's selling you something that says do S&OP and this will get better, or buy this solution and it will make this stuff better is lying to you. I've done this enough times to tell you with 100% certainty, if you don't have these basic blocking and tackling pieces in place, your S&OP is not going to be successful. Now, that isn't to say, don't bother looking at S&OP. What it means is understand what your limitations are and be able to level set your expectations of the S&OP process, because you're not doing S&OP until you can do these basic things. So then expecting your S&OP to be successful when you can't do these things doesn't mean S&OP doesn't work in your company. It just means you haven't built all the parts that you have to make it work.
What's actually interesting and sort of, I'm not going to say it's off topic, but what are the actual dangers of starting with S&OP versus starting with the actual, operational demand and supply planning? The way I always see it, S&OP, aggregate, or we get an aggregate forecast, we get a top-down forecast. So one of the dangers I would see is, okay, we're going to do top-down forecasting. If we start with S&OP, which is, from my perspective, very, very dangerous. What are any other issues you might see when you start that way around?
The big one is, as with any cultural endeavor, ultimately to get people to make the cultural endeavor work means getting their trust. Like no matter what other corporate words you want to put around it, at the end of the day, you're asking people to trust you to do something that they've been doing a long time differently. And the reason that you're trying to get them to do it differently is because what you're ultimately promising them, if only implicitly, is that their job is going to become more effective and more valuable if they do this thing differently, and the organization is going to be more successful if they do it differently. The difficulty, or the danger, as you put it, Danny, of starting before you're ready, or starting without even visibility of what the challenges will be, is you've essentially gone to your team and said, listen, we're going to start to plan differently than we did before. We're going to start to do a bunch of things differently than we did before, but don't worry, the reason we're doing this is because we're going to get better fill rates, we're going to get better inventory turns, we're going to get better return on invested capital. All these things are going to magically follow. And for sure, there's decades of research that shows when you do it well, that happens. The problem is, if you don't have the forecasting right, and more likely, if you don't have the ability to do effective supply planning, and this is something distinct from scheduling, if you can't do these functions well, then once you've convinced people to come with you on this S&OP journey, and after 6 months of hard work, because it's difficult learning new processes, buying into new processes, and you're not making any progress because these basic tactical functions haven't gotten better, not only are you going to frustrate people and have wasted their time, but the bigger problem is it's going to be even more difficult to convince them to come along the next time you try to do S&OP correctly.
Thanks for David, and Leidy, we're going to want to go to the actual practical implementation of S&OP. I'm kind of curious, so maybe Leidy first, how have you, or in case of David, how should you actually build your S&OP process from maybe a very practical perspective? Of course, there's the cultural change, but also how did you actually engage your management? How do you run the actual meetings? What are topics that come forward? Maybe a little bit of master data management, and what sort of tools do you actually use in the process to run the S&OP process?
So at Factors, we have been doing S&OP since 2015, but to be honest, it was not very efficient at the beginning. We kind of relaunched the whole process 2 years ago, and now with the participation of management. And I think that was a big win for the company, because now the process has more accountability, having the managers there. And also it accelerates the decision-making process when you have the head of the different areas involved in this whole process. Also, it's easier to move from very detailed levels that people are talking about only 4 months ahead and talking about specific SKUs in the meetings. Now it's more strategic. We try to focus more on longer period and avoid talking about certain issues that happens at a very detailed and SKU level. That also make the whole meetings more efficient.
Mm-hmm. And those, I think, part of S&OP, and that, the cross-functional relationship with different departments, whether it be marketing, sales, and operations. When do you discuss those details? Like, because if they're not discussed with the XX, that makes sense. But how do you actually go about solving those, which I think to a certain extent is also part of the S&OP process. There might be different levels in the process. When do you discuss those?
So like I think that Jonathon had a very good answer to that question, and it's the S&OP is not meant to resolve all the issues in the company. It's just there to make you aware of where do you have to focus and where do you have to be putting your attention to. So, for example, we have a demand planning meeting where we discuss how we're doing, how we are tracking versus the target. How does the next 18 months look going forward? How the categories are performing. And then after that, and then in that meeting, we have the head of finance, the head of the sales in the different business units, and also the VP of supply chain and develop a demand planner. And then we have another meeting for supply planning where the operational capacity is discussed versus the forecast. So we look at what is the forecast going forward and then how we're going to react to that horizon. So I think it's an excellent process. I think all the companies should adopt it. I mean, it's all benefits once you have an S&OP or Ibp process that is working well.
So Gartner estimates that something like 78% of S&OP implementations fail in the first attempt. And the number one reason they say they fail is because of lack of management buy-in. And I guess both because of my personal curiosity, because as you know, Leidy, I worked with you and I worked with Factors to help implement S&OP, but also for the people on the call. One of the things you mentioned earlier in your comments was around how in this sort of relaunch of S&OP, one of the big changes for you and the reason that it's been much more valuable is you've got management at the table, you've got greater accountability. Sorry, I'm kind of preempting Danny's function here, but I've got a question for you. I mean, for the people watching, how do you get to that? Because like one of the number one challenges is a lot of companies have a middle management team that says, hey, let's do S&OP, and then expect someone else is going to go and do it. How do you get management at the table? What was the big change for you guys?
Well, you have the different areas as Danny presented in the slides there, and it's basically if I'm the head of demand planning, I would like to know how the process would benefit my area, and it's all about explaining how the process would help you to be more efficient and bring more value to the company. And if I'm the head of demand planning, I would like to know how I can make my forecast better. So having a better communication between areas and having the information about how my forecast would affect the other different areas, of course, is beneficial for me and also for the other areas participating.
Thanks, Leidy. David, so again, treated live on an early stage of the S&OP journey. What sort of buy-in do you see from current C-level, but also middle management? Do you think you have all the support to start rolling this out?
Well, it's going to be a journey. We've recently had some changes in our senior levels, so I think it's a good opportunity now to join with the change process, and I think change has to be part of this as well. And Leidy hit on it very well, that they started trying to do one thing and then they rebranded to another thing, but you have to have that management approval, that management buy-in, because if you don't, then all the other departments aren't, I don't know what the right word to use, aren't interested in doing it. It's not important to them. I did a quality course years ago, and one of the things they said is if it's not a top-down approach, then it very rarely works, because it's not considered to be important at the other levels of the business. And making sure that you have these functions, and Jonathon mentioned it, make sure your demand planning is working, your supply planning is working, all that rolls up. And if it doesn't, then the benefits are very rarely seen by other areas of the organization, and get your I hate to use this, but get your ducks in a row before you start too far down the journey, or else, like you said, when you fail, or if it fails or doesn't work very well, then it's a struggle to get it restarted again, because people lose faith and they move on to something else. There's always hundreds of projects going on every year, and someone moves on to another project that's maybe more important or more burning issues. So I think that's probably the journey we're going to start.
What do you see as the bigger benefits outside of the supply chain planning department, be it marketing, sales, operations, and logistics, separating those consciously from supply chain planning?
I think for us. Question? Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jonathon. Sorry.
No, you beat me to it, David. Go ahead.
I was just going to say. I mean, I think, and Leidy hit on this as well. It's collaboration. It's showing people what's in it for me. It's very important to each other area. If we're running off buying a bunch of stuff that marketing may want us to buy, but sales isn't selling, then you're going to have an inventory problem at some point in time, and obviously a cash problem at some point in time. So you want to make sure that's all aligned, and I think that's really, really key.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to follow on David's comments, I'd say there's potential benefit to every department in an organization to S&OP, and I think you only start to see that when you stop looking at S&OP as an operations framework or a supply chain framework, and start to understand this is a company-wide strategic planning framework. It happens to have operations in it. It also has sales in it. But the purpose of this function is basically to be the conduit through which all the various pieces of information across the company can flow. And every part of the S&OP framework, whether it's marketing, like you said, Danny, or product development, or finance, I mean, basically anything that isn't supply chain, anyone from whom you're asking for input in the S&OP process, you're also giving something in return. So for example, when we're asking product planning to provide an advanced look at what's in the development pipeline over the next 24 months, what's in the planned obsolescence pipeline over the next 24 months, how are they currently managing the portfolio? Do we have opportunities to make stocking decision changes on certain SKUs? Are we going to be taking pricing action on certain SKUs that will have a knock-on effect on demand, that will have a driver to the forecast? What we're giving that team in exchange is an iterative snapshot of what our forward-looking capacity is. So they will understand at any given time what the reality of being able to launch some of these new products looks like. A forward-looking snapshot of available inventory and network. So do I have space for products? Do I need to tweak my launch plans to account for the fact that certain parts of my network are jammed? But most importantly, what they're also getting is an iterative view of the demand outlook of the market and the business. So David mentioned what's in it for me, and this is really what's at the core of every one of these linkages of S&OP across the organization. When you're doing it well, you're not looking at S&OP as an operations tool or an operations plan or an operations framework. What you're looking at is this framework that allows every functional part of the business to be aligning behind one strategic plan and executing to it.
Mm-hmm.
If I might add to Jonathan's point, you know, what we just went through over the last year and a half is a really good example of how communication, collaboration can work together to really give a good message to the organization. I mean, we had tons of supply chain challenges. I'm sure I'm not speaking to anybody who hasn't seen that on this call, but being able to get all the groups together to get a message across, this is what's happening, is really important as well. So you're not just, you know, you try to communicate with one group, but you're communicating with everybody. And this is the plan. This is where the plan is going off. This is what we're doing to write the plan, write the ship, write the plan, write the process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so kind of to go to the last topic of this discussion, it's one that Jonathan really wanted to talk about, which is collaboration versus consensus forecasts. So to you know, sort of explain the question, if we talk as everyone talks about S&OP, and one of the terms often mentioned is you know, we're building a consensus forecast, which is definitely, you know, a hot, let's call it a marketing term. So if we're creating that alignment on a plan, collaboration versus consensus, Jonathan, your opinion.
This is, I mean, so far, Danny, basically 3/4 of the time that I say something, you thank me for my extensive comments. This is one. This is one that's difficult for me not to be extensive on because I am passionate about it. But I'll do my best to, as usual, keep it brief. I agree with you, Danny. Mind you, you were trying to tee that up for me anyway. A lot of people get confused about consensus versus collaboration. So let me first say that I'm a huge proponent of collaboration, obviously. The whole point of S&OP at its core is collaboration. That's all it is. It's strategically balancing the needs of our customers against our internal ability to meet those needs and collaborating across the organization to do the best job we can. It's not more complicated than that. It's more difficult than that, but it's not more complicated than that. Consensus is a whole different thing. Consensus in supply chain, consensus in S&OP is nonsense. And anybody who argues that or tells you that because of S&OP, they're getting consensus at these S&OP meetings from sales and operations and procurement and marketing, they're either like blatantly lying to you or the people at the table are lying to them. And the reason I say that is because it's not possible, if you're doing this well, for everyone with such different reward systems. I mean, in many companies, we incentivize the exact opposite behaviors between sales and operations. Not everyone, and some companies have gotten smarter about having unified KPIs and success measures. But in many organizations, you're bonusing sales for completely different types of behaviors than you're bonusing finance and operations. So when you're asking these two disparate groups to look at the same problem and come up with a consensus, I mean, it's a recipe for disaster. But what I think is more important is S&OP needs to be understood to be a framework for collaboration where differing viewpoints can be aired, where we can get the benefit of opposing views and understand that opposing views, rather than being a bad thing, like a thing we're trying to get rid of so we can have consensus, are in fact a very powerful thing that makes us more aware of the full landscape of the possibilities for solutions, which isn't to say that everyone's going to be happy at the end of an S&OP meeting. In fact, when I'm facilitating an S&OP meeting, if I'm hearing everybody agree, I'm going to start poking people and cold calling people until we get some disagreement. Because if everyone's agreeing around that table, we have a lot of useless people at the table. I mean, we don't need everyone agreeing. We need to hear all the reasons that what we're talking about might not work, so that we can ensure that we've got a robust plan.
Mhm.
So to wrap it up as succinctly as I can now, Danny, collaboration is the process of ensuring that everyone who needs to be engaged has been engaged. Consensus isn't required to move forward. What is required to move forward is everyone's buy-in, that we have heard from everyone we need to, that we've consulted all the information that we need to, and that a majority of people are directionally aligned behind the plan we're going to have moving forward. And that once we leave that S&OP meeting, and this is key, once we leave that S&OP meeting, even if you were on the other side of that decision, you're not going to spend the next month cycle until a following meeting working against that, or complaining to people at the water cooler, or hoping it fails. You're going to do your best to get behind that plan and make sure it's successful. And then in retrospect, 6 months later, when this is another beauty of S&OP, it's that post-mortem that we always do. As we look back and see what happened and see who was right and who was wrong, we learn from it. And we course correct for next time. But consensus not only doesn't happen, I would argue it shouldn't happen.
Very, very interesting perspective. And I hear you say the word we, and I'm just assuming you mean, supply chain planning. So maybe a question for Leidy to follow up. From a demand planning perspective, are you the one actually still owning the plan that comes out of S&OP? That's, I think, what I hear Jonathon saying. Maybe I'm misinterpreting, but is it really demand planning that takes ownership and the lead of the process to gather all that info?
We lead the process from the demand planning perspective, but every area is equally accountable.
Correct.
And so,
I
Jonathon,
think he was looking for more, Leidy.
Oh.
I 100% agree, though.
Danny, just ask exactly what you're looking for.
He wants me to be less extensive. He wants you to be more extensive.
I'll try to rephrase that a little bit. Jonathon is talking about, okay, you're not going to reach consensus. You shouldn't reach consensus. But I think as a demand planner, you are the one that makes a demand plan, and that gets aggregated up, and we turn that into a budget comparison. So if we don't have consensus, do you still own the demand plan that's there? Because there's obviously things that drive that. So I think it could be very difficult if sales or marketing says, okay, we're going to do this promotion, we're pushing it, but you don't have the inventory to say, okay, I'm disagreeing with this, I can't do it, but then they're running another way. So I was kind of wondering, how do you deal with this from a supply chain planning perspective if there's no consensus on the plan?
No. So before you answer, Leidy, I'm going to clarify what I was saying. So we have to take a step back when we're talking about consensus. Within each of the discrete steps of the S&OP process, obviously we need to know, what is our plan for each of these buckets? What's our plan in the product review step? What's our plan on demand? What's our plan within operations to execute that demand? What's our plan within finance to use that plan to try to execute what our annual operating plan is? Where we're not going to have consensus is across each of those steps, where we've got a demand plan and operations is saying, like, we know your forecast is going to be wrong. You're wrong every month. And a lot of organizations, what that means is they say, well, to hell with your forecast. I'm going to build what I know you actually need, because I've been building stuff for 25 years and you guys have been using this new software for 18 months and you're always wrong. So collaboration means everyone that's done their job has done their job correctly in the demand planning process. So Leidy, like she said, is responsible for leading the process, for getting all the inputs she needs to from sales, from marketing, from product management. She doesn't own the number, though. I mean, how can she possibly? She's getting inputs from all these other stakeholders. Every one of these stakeholders owns their part of the process. But operations, as has the responsibility to execute against that plan and not to second guess it with their own plans. Consensus across the entirety of the S&OP process can't happen. It won't happen because you have all these differing views. But of course, within each of these discrete steps, we need to have a number that we're running with.
Thank you. I think that makes sense.
Sorry, ladies. I kind of stole part of your answer by clarifying. Was there anything you want to add?
No, it's exactly that. Of course, at the end of the day, we have to run with one number that everybody's kind of agreeing.
Well, everyone knows it's wrong too. Let's be honest. I mean, it's going to be wrong every month. It's just how wrong are we going to be? That's the reality.
But what we're adding to that number is like, yes, we're all going to work with this figure, but then I want to make you aware that these are the risks and these are the assumptions that are going to be also part of that figure that we're agreeing with. Yeah.
So there's a certain assumption that a marketing action is this successful and really working back that let's say accountability to the other teams that drive that change, right? Yeah.
Yes.
David, maybe for you, any comments you have on collaboration versus consensus? Do you think consensus is possible, or we should, as Jonathon said, really try to collaborate and be aware that there's different targets within departments, different KPIs?
Well, I agree. I agree with Jonathan's assessment of collaboration versus consensus. Leidy said something very important at the end of what she said was, the risks. And I think part of the collaboration piece, allowing everybody to have have their opinions during the process is very important, because you're going to show those risks where they stand up. And as we said, what does it look like after we've executed? So you have your post-mortem. Where are we compared to that? So those risks or those factors are very important to be brought out when you are doing your collaboration, because in the consensus, you're just not everybody's going to agree. It's impossible, as Jonathon said. It's just not going to happen. So you got to get to a number that everybody's comfortable with and follow that number. Everybody executes to try and meet that number, and then you see where you are after the fact with all of the the opinions that people have had on during the collaboration stage.
In addition, you're baking mitigations into your operations plan because that number is going to be wrong. I mean, every forecaster says this. The forecast is always wrong, and for a lot of them, they think it's like a get out of jail free card. Like, oh, the forecast is always wrong. So why are you bugging me that my forecast was wrong? But the point of the forecast is always wrong isn't that you don't have to work hard at the forecast. It's that if you're calibrating your supply chain on the assumption that your forecast needs to be correct, you're going to be in for a world of hurt, because it's not going to be correct. It's going to be varying degrees of wrong. But collaboration is also about accepting what the error bars are on average on either side of that forecast, and then baking in the appropriate strategies downstream in operations and supply to mitigate against that, so that you can continue to delight your customers and continue to meet your internal financial goals.
That's a very, very good closing statement, and I started to really want to get rid of the forecast is always wrong. We should just stick with the customer is always unpredictable, and I do it myself. I do groceries sometimes on Thursday, sometimes on Friday, and that's making it hard on their forecasters. So we should really step away from that, especially as we go into an S&OP process, because that that ideas that we can actually shape and predict the world. It's definitely not always true. So making a last round against all the with all the panelists to make some closing remarks before we go into a couple of minutes of Q&A. Jonathon, you got any last statements? Anything you felt was left untold?
I think, you know, in the time that we had, we touched on some of the topics that I think are most important for people who are looking to implement S&OP in their organizations. Leidy talked about the need for management engagement and accountability. David talked about those linkages with the other departments, talked about it being a cultural change, and that's really key. I just think I would just come back and reiterate what I said early on, which is there's a lot of great things that S&OP has been proven to do for your organization. And you know, as you get more mature at S&OP, call it IBP, call it EBP, there's a knock-on effect on your inventory velocity, on your fill rates, on your in-stock rates, on your return on invested capital, on your cash conversion cycle, on your EBITDA. Like there's lots of great stuff that doing S&OP well will provide you financially. But it's contingent upon being able to do the core functions of S&OP in the first place. And really, don't let anybody fool you into thinking that starting out on an S&OP journey is going to, in and of itself, make you better at forecasting or make you better at supply planning or procurement, because it doesn't work that way. It enhances those functions, but it doesn't build those functions.
Yeah, very well said. Leidy, any closing remarks from your end?
Sure. I'm just going to steal one of my manager's quotes about S&OP, and, and it's the fact that it's a very dynamic process, and it's never going to be perfect, and it's going to continue to evolve every time. So yeah, I think it's a great process to have within the organization. A really good way of getting that collaboration that is so much needed. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Leidy. David, any last comments from you?
I was just going to focus on the collaboration piece. I think it's really important to tie the organization together with all areas focusing on one thing. And, you know, I jump on Jonathan's comments about, you know, it's not going to make your forecasting better. It's not going to make those other pieces better. It's just part of the evolution of how the whole process works, and getting everybody together to collaborate, you know, the next 18 months or the next period of time you want to focus on.
Thank you. So I want to leave a couple of minutes for a Q&A. I actually did not see any questions pop up in the chat. If there's anyone who has a question for any of the participants, wait, there are actually questions. Let me just GoToWebinar has not a really good way of showing me questions. So I have if I show you guys how awkward this question module is, you'd laugh, because what are the best practices to monitor the S&OP outputs? Who feels best to answer these?
That's a big question. I can take an initial quick stab at it. Can you repeat the question again? To monitor the S&OP outputs?
Yeah. What's the best practice?
Okay, so really quickly, a lot of people get hung up on S&OP metrics versus performance metrics. And what I mean by that is, let's remember that S&OP, we're doing S&OP to impact corporate performance. We're not doing S&OP in and of itself because it's fun. So measuring the health of S&OP is interesting, and I'll talk real quickly about a couple of metrics that I think matter a lot that I'm pretty sure other people won't talk about because they're not sexy at all. But it's also really important to understand that we need to be monitoring corporate financial metrics in parallel with our S&OP metrics. We're doing S&OP to delight our customers. So we should be watching our fill rates. We should be watching our OTIF. We should be watching our return rates. We should be watching our in-stocks. On the demand side, we should be watching our return on invested capital, our inventory turns on the supply side. Because if those things aren't getting better, ultimately, why are we doing S&OP? Now, with respect to the health of the S&OP process, my co-panelists and basically everywhere online will give you a ton of great metrics to measure each of these meetings. And I think to do S&OP well, it needs to be data led and measurement led. So you need measures for each of them. But I'm going to go sort of a meta level above and say, to make sure your meetings are running well, one of the key metrics you need to be looking at is attendance. And the second key measure you need to be looking at is action items. And those might seem incredibly basic, but I'll tell you what, I've worked with a lot of organizations that have amazing dashboards showing all kinds of different performance metrics and are wondering why their S&OP meetings don't work. And when you look back at the attendance or the actions that are taken by these meetings, there's no one at them and they're not taking any actions. So you need to be looking at whether or not you have the right people at the meetings by measuring attendance. You need to be looking at whether or not those people were effective by measuring the actions that were given by people and assigned to people. And if you have people over multiple months who are not giving actions or taking actions, they're not adding value.
Yeah. Any, there's one more question, which actually I think comes down to the same. You know, what is the point that you start thinking about dashboards in your S&OP journey? And I know it's going to be really difficult to establish good KPIs, and I think a lot of KPIs are not necessarily related to the S&OP process, but they might be viewed as such. You know, from my background, I'm thinking stock turn. Of course, better planning could improve stock turn, but still, it's one thing that's mostly driven by, okay, how much are we actually, you know, putting in safety stock? How often are we buying? Which are much bigger drivers of stock turn than anything in the S&OP process ever will. So, Leidy, do you use any dashboards in the S&OP process versus the regular, maybe, you know, forecast metrics that you use for operational planning?
Yes, we present the main KPIs for each area during the meetings.
And what are some of those KPIs?
So for demand planning, we would present forecast accuracy percentage and how we're tracking, and also bias. And from supply, present service levels and overview of capacity utilization.
Okay. And then David, how about your organization?
Well, as we still measure the you know, service level, turns, things like that, OTIP as Jonathon mentioned. So, you know, and you know, it's important to go back to what we said earlier, is those functions that forecasting and things like that have to be there as the sort of the main drivers of being able to do a good S&OP process exist. So you already have KPIs kind of built into those functions already, and if you're doing them well, then those KPIs will continue to be part of the process. And I Jonathon's comment about attendance and action items, so important. You can't have a meeting with 2 people in the room, and you can't have any success unless you know what you're trying to get done, and making sure those people that are those action items are being actioned before the next meeting or before the next pre-meeting, so that you're not falling behind.
Mm-hmm.
Danny, the question about when is the right time for dashboards, I would really, and this has been the theme of, you know, most of the discussion, for me it's about ROI. I think dashboards are great, so long as they're actionable, so long as they're interpretable, and so long as it doesn't cost you more to deploy the dashboards than what the anticipated benefit of the dashboard is. You know, for many organizations, that break even comes early, because it takes, if you're doing the metrics graphs in your meetings by hand, it's taking someone's time. That's time that could be spent on some other activity, and frankly, it's non-value added time.
Yeah.
But you have to weigh what the cost of deploying that dashboard is and figure that out. But I think it's different for every organization.
Very well said. So we're through the questions. I want to thank all the panelists for their very valuable contributions. To the audience, we'll be sharing out the slide deck, and I know there's someone asking for a recording. We'll look into that. But yeah, first, thanks Jonathon, thanks Leidy, and thanks David for being here. Hope to see all of you again soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, always a pleasure to join you, Danny.
Yeah, thank you.
everyone have a good night.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye bye.